Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. We're happy to welcome back Gary Hylander. I'm Martha Feeney-Patton from the library, and we have Estelle Keast from the Council on Aging who greeted you in the back. This program is sponsored by the Friends of the Library and the Friends of the Council on Aging. And then we also have some refreshments that were donated by the atrium at Brown Hill, so help yourself to those at any point. We have a handout also about other lectures that we have coming up this fall. You mentioned this is a two-part series with Gary Hylander, but we did registration separately for the 2 weeks, so if you're not sure if you signed up for both weeks and you want to be, you can check with us at the desk downstairs. And then we'll have Richard Travers giving 2 lectures on music in October, and then a 2-part series by Jason Giannetti on myth and religion. So we're looking forward to all of those. There's also information on the back of the sheet about our art series coming next March. So we're not taking registrations for that one yet, but we wanted to share the information so you can mark your calendars. And without further ado,
let me get started.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to do. We're trying to do a 15-week course in 2 hours. All right, so put on your seatbelts. And so we're gonna go a mile wide and a quarter of an inch deep, today and the next time we meet. And just a little maybe a preview of coming attractions, something for you to consider is that a nice sequel to this, is the Cold War, Harry Truman and Eisenhower and so forth. But today, this afternoon, I'm reporting for duty, and we are going to open up with World War II in a global sense. And I want to underscore this. I mean, that World War II, and depending on where one lived, if one lived in China or you lived in Japan, World War II began in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria. If one lived in Ethiopia, back then Abyssinia, World War II began in 1935 with the Italian attack along the coastline of East Africa. If one lived in Poland, if one lived in Germany, if one lived in Poland, let's start there, the war broke out in September of 1939. And for you and for me, it's a date which will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. So this is a global war. And Pearl Harbor, I'll come back to this, the attack on Pearl Harbor globalized World War II. And World War II was the most cataclysmic event of the 20th century. Let me give you a number. 20,000 people a day died during World War II. I mean, it was catastrophic. And the seeds for World War II, and this is another topic for another afternoon, the seeds of World War II were planted in the aftermath of the Great War of 1914. And that was the Paris Peace Conference. And to be specific, the treaty with Germany and the Treaty of Versailles, 1918, 1919. So we have an awful lot to rake over, this afternoon. And let's begin, let's back it up. And let's back it up to 1940. And Franklin Roosevelt, the great Franklin Roosevelt, I think I've told you I did my doctoral dissertation on FDR. And so I'm kind of an FDR guy, but don't tell my grandmother. She's a Republican's grandmother. And I know she was very proud that I earned my doctorate from BC. Don't ask, don't tell. She never asked me what I did, what my topic was. Because if I told her FDR, there would have been a thump. All right? She would have had a heart attack right then and there. So it was don't ask, don't tell. So in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt is elected to his 3rd term in office. The 22nd Amendment was not on the books yet. And there were many questions in the 1940 election, but the big one is what will be the role of America, if any, in this war that has erupted almost globally. We're still up. And Franklin Roosevelt knew that war was coming. He couldn't say that because most of the country was still concerned with the unemployment rate of the Depression. The New Deal was working its costly magic, depending on your politics, it's costly magic through the American economy. We were beginning to profit with Lend-Lease and so forth, from the European war. And Roosevelt had to be careful because so much of the country was isolationist. And so many Americans believed, that we had been tricked, tricked into World War I, tricked into World War I by British propaganda, tricked into World War I by the financiers, the bankers, who had loaned billions of dollars to the Allies. And if they get beat, the bankers lose their money. Tricked into war by the munitions merchants, the later on had been called the merchants of death. So Roosevelt had to be careful, and he could talk about the possibility of war, but he knew he had to be careful. And the war came unexpectedly. Most people believed, and Roosevelt certainly believed, that if the United States got pulled in, it would be because of German U-boat activity, in the North Atlantic. Instead, it caught many people, not paying attention. It occurred at Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was, and I'll be generous here, it was a great intelligence failure, wasn't it? American intelligence was spread with the Army, the Navy, Army Air Force, and a great deal of it was not shared. And this is why, if I can just tip my hand and then get back to the narrative, at the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war, that we need to concentrate our intelligence. And from that will come the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, that we cannot have all these intelligence reports scattered among all these agencies. So 1940, and let's go to Japan, because that's where it starts, for us anyway. In 1940, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who was an old school diplomat, that Cordell Hull huddled with Franklin Roosevelt, and others. And what do we do? And how do we respond to this growing, desperate, bloody, savage war in Asia, being conducted by Japan, certainly throughout all of China, the rape of China, 1937. And we are enabling this war. We are enabling the Japanese in a number of ways. One, we're selling them oil. Japan has no oil and had no oil. We're selling them oil, and one cannot have an industrialize and fight a war without oil. Secondly, that we are selling them steel, iron, and other materials that they're using for the war. And how do we try to use our economic sanctions? Maybe that's a better word to use. It's a modern term. How do we leverage our economic sanctions against the Japanese? And this is Cordell Hull and others, State Department, and FDR. And the Japanese ambassador was invited in. And he was told a number of things. A, we are no longer going to sell you oil, which was you needed for war. We're no longer going to sell you oil. We are no longer going to sell you scrap metals. Much of that came home in the bodies of American soldiers. And thirdly, we're going to freeze your assets. Your money's no good here. We're going to freeze your assets in American banks. Now, there might be a reconsideration, and the ambassador doesn't want to hear this, but he has to relay it to Tokyo, obviously. We may reconsider if you, 1, evacuate China, 2, guarantee the borders of your neighbors, and 3, change your friends, dump your friends. That the Japanese were in what was called the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Pact, with Mussolini, Hitler, and Hirohito, or Tojo. So change your friends, evacuate China, and we may consider selling oil to you again. Well, that was completely unacceptable. The Japanese were proud. They were a powerful nation in Asia, and we're not going to allow the Americans to dictate Japanese foreign policy. See, the Japanese were talking about Asia for the Asians, the economical prosperity sphere, and that we should clear out all white colonials from Asia. Now, what the Japanese really meant by that, the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, What they really meant was Asia for Japan. You know, and we need to clear out these white colonials, the French, the Dutch, the English.
And sorry to interrupt, if anyone's parked kind of pulled up on the side in the not marked parking spots, we do need those cars to move. I think
It's my aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
I'm about to attack Pearl Harbor. It ain't me, babe.
Staff moving their cars.
Wow, look at all these lawbreakers. We'll deal with you later. This is unacceptable to Tokyo, you know, that these Americans are dictating our foreign policy. Absolutely unacceptable. And that after discussion, and I'll be brief here because we want to, you know, I want to get to a certain point, you know, at the end of our conversation, that in order to begin to clear out the colonials, that we need the white colonial powers, we need to strike at Pearl Harbor and to strike a blow Asia for Japan. And we need to clear out the Americans. In 1940, by 1940, mid-1940, you know, France had been overrun. So that meant that the tungsten, the tin, and the oil, the rubber, and the rice of Indochina was available. The Dutch had been overrun as well, which meant the Dutch oil fields were available. Churchill, England, the Battle of Britain, they were barely hanging on. And it looks as if the British oil will be available as well. You remembered where you parked, huh?
I did.
We'll get you as well. We having problems remembering where we park? Every once in a while, I have to rethink that as well. You know, where did I park? In order to make this happen, we need to clear the Americans out of Pearl Harbor as well. And also out of the Philippines, read Douglas MacArthur there. Because if one can visualize the map, to be able to make a run in Indochina, maybe even Australia. The Japanese thought big here. The victory disease. You know, some historians talk about Japanese victory disease because it came so quick, it came so easy until 42 and 43, the Midway. And the Philippines are on our flank. That if we send troop ships and battleships, you know, down the slot into Indochina, Australia, in the oil fields, the Americans in the Philippines are on our flank, and they may be able to handle that attack. So we have to deal with them, and they're at Pearl Harbor as well. And Admiral Yamamoto is tasked with planning an attack at Pearl Harbor. An intelligence failure. The principal American intelligence failure of all of World War II. The second one, the only one that comes close to it, late in the war, and that's the Battle of the Bulge. We won't get that. We won't get there today. That's the second greatest intelligence failure. So Yamamoto is brought in. Yamamoto was a gambler. He was a gambler. He was a hustler. He was bold, resourceful, and he was told to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. He said, "You ought not do that. You ought not do that. I've been to America. I've been to America. I've been to Harvard Business School. I've been to America. And I've seen all the shuttered factories and the oil wells and so forth, and the enormous workforce that these Americans have. And I recommend, if we're going to attack," and he said, "I don't recommend it at all. But if you insist, if you want me to put a plan together, let's wait until the Americans get involved in Europe. And then maybe attack. And maybe then, I don't think they will. I know these Americans, you're not going to be able to break their jaw and blacken their eyes, and they're going to roll over and take it. I recommend that we do not attack. However, at least wait until the United States gets involved in the Atlantic, German U-boats. Do your job." Sounds like Belichick, huh? Do your job. We'll take care of any diplomatic concerns. So Yamamoto puts together a plan that, as he thinks it through, needs to have secrecy, speed, and there's no declaration of war. The declaration of war will be the air attack on that Sunday. We need speed, secrecy, and an overwhelming victory at Pearl Harbor. We need to sink the entire fleet. We need what you and I would describe as a strategic victory, not a tactical victory. A tactical victory is you bloody the enemy, but they're able to go to the corner and their cut man gets them into the ring for round 2. That's a tactical victory. We need a strategic victory. We need to come hard, fast, and big, knock them down, they don't get up, and then maybe we get a deal. Otherwise, they'll be back. I know these Americans. And I know they don't have much of a military power right now, and he knew that. You know, in 1940, the United States was ranked, in 1940, the United States was ranked 39th as a military power. 39. So much of the money, had gone into New Deal programs. And the military was placed on a very lean budget. This was a tough time. If you were a career officer in the 1930s, you weren't going anywhere. Let me give you a little factoid to hang your hat on. That when World War II began, Eisenhower was a colonel or a lieutenant colonel. A colonel. That's not a bad rank. It gets your parking privileges. But within 3.5 years, he's a 5-star general. It's the war, and it's you're coming at me way too fast. All right, it's the war. A 5-star general in 3.5 years. It's the rank, isn't it? It's 5 stars. Even the Lord picks up the phone for a 5-star general. My brother has 1 star, and he doesn't. I don't call him general, and he doesn't call me doctor. He's Lance. I'm Gary. All right. So that's how we keep that. So the war really moved these careers along. When Yamamoto put the attack together, 2 fleets disappeared from Tokyo Harbor. One fleet went on a long northerly course to attack the Hawaiian Islands from the north, and the other one, moved south toward the rice of Indochina, the rubber, Michelin rubber of Indochina, and to the oil of Indochina. And in brushing by the Philippines, we need to attack the Philippines as well. When war comes, it comes literally overnight. And for FDR and his planners, it didn't come in the Atlantic, it occurred in the Pacific. Now, just a word or two, maybe a paragraph about Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was not on the, he was not with the fleet. He was not with the fleet. It was his plan, but he's not executing it. He's considered too valuable. We don't want to lose you. And Admiral Nagumo was in charge of executing the attack. Now, Nagumo did not believe in the efficacy of air power. See, he was a traditional navalist, fleet to fleet, fleet to fleet. Yamamoto, that we need to surprise the Americans through the air. 350 fighter planes, dive bombers, low-level dive bombers. He advocated air power, a quick, sudden strike, and deep six the entire fleet. Nagumo did not believe in the efficacy of air power, but here's the plan, executed. And he did. And he was told, Yamamoto told Nagumo, I don't mean to rhyme with them, but the name's rhyming, that you can expect to lose about half of your attack aircraft. He went out with 350 and change. So the strike took place. But when the pilots returned, and the wing commanders returned, they urged Nagumo, we need to rearm, refuel, and go back and have a second strike. We didn't hit everything. We were running out of fuel. We were running out of ammunition. And we need to go back and finish the job. We missed several of the battleships. We missed the submarine pens. We missed the repair facilities. We missed the oil tanks. We missed half of our objectives. Refuel, rearm, and go back. And how many planes have we lost? About 26 to 29. And Yamamoto had told me we're going to lose maybe half of our fighter aircraft. I have fulfilled my mission. Mission accomplished. And I am not, you may be asking why or thinking anyway, why he did not radio back to Tokyo and get permission for a second strike. Should I go back? And I'll tell you why he did not, rather. He had been instructed not to break radio silence. And I need to refuel to get back. And if I break radio silence to ask for permission to launch a second wave, that might reveal my position and the fact that I need to refuel to get back under any circumstances. So we have accomplished our mission. And I am not asking for a second air attack. He will remember that era at the Battle of Midway. And Midway will turn everything around shortly. So Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt. I would love to give this message. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, standing before a roaring, standing Congress. And he listened to the speech, and you can hear the buzz, the background chatter, men scraping their feet. They wanted to declare war. And Roosevelt goes on for 6 minutes and 32 seconds, laying it out. It's a great speech. I'd love to give it. And boy, all of his Episcopalian fury was there. And you know what an Episcopalian is angry when he or she does that? They grind their teeth. My grandmother was an Episcopalian. And when she bared her teeth like that, watch out, boys. Boys, that's my brother-in-law. She raised us for a number of years, and she counted cookies. boys. Roosevelt, a date which will live in infamy. Not a day. That's too soft, isn't it? A date which will live in infamy. Who do they think we are? We will win through. We will win through into righteous victory. Righteous victory. Who do they think we are? And now the big question is, because 3 days later, on the 11th of December, what a mistake, Mussolini and Hitler both declared war on the United States. So suddenly overnight, we're involved in a two-front war. Suddenly overnight, we have a globalized World War II. And again, we're ranked 39th as a military power. 39th. And who's number 40? Who's gaining on us? On the outside, coming up on the outside, Portugal at number 40. Roosevelt knew that. He couldn't say that to the country. I'm Commander-in-Chief. I've got to square my shoulders, lock my hips, get a steely look in my eye. And the debate was around the country, whom do we attack first? Do we attack the Japanese because they struck us without warning, and now the Germans have declared war, and the Italians. And we don't have enough, at least initially, to cover both fronts. So the decision was to go on the offensive as best we could in early 42 against the Germans and the Italians. And the Germans were seen as being much more dangerous as a long-term threat than the Japanese because of the size of their army, the rapidity of their success, blitzkrieg, and most importantly and most dangerously, their research and development. They were German physicists. They were good, absolutely good at what they did. I'm going to drop this in right now. Albert Einstein's letter, you can get it online, it's 2 pages. Albert Einstein was encouraged by, Albert Einstein had fled Germany, the anti-Semitism and so forth. He and many others had fled Germany. And he had been joined by men with names such as Edward Teller. Who else was part of that gang? Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard. And they had been in the country early on urging the American military or anybody that would listen that you guys need to rearm. You guys need some theoretical work being done on the possibility of breaking the nucleus of an atom and using it for maybe peaceful purposes, but for wartime purposes as well. Well, let me just finish my thought. They weren't getting anywhere. The American military was concerned about more fundamental things, prosaic things. For example, getting more mileage per gallon of gas for a tank. A tank got one mile per gallon. We need to do better. How do we get more mileage out of a fighter plane? How do we better defend a battleship at the waterline? And Fermi and Teller, you guys don't get it. If the Germans get the bomb, they win their war. And they've already got the research going on. You've got nothing. So they went to Einstein. Everybody knew the name Einstein. And I mean, the word lawn here came from Einstein. You know, and Dr. Einstein, maybe they call him Al, I don't know. You have to write a letter to President Roosevelt. He'll recognize the name. I'm a pacifist. Not now. There's too much at stake. Read the letter. And in that letter, Einstein has a long story there which we don't have time for. In the last paragraph, Einstein speculates. It's theoretical physics. He speculates that maybe if we can split an atom and release the energy of an atom, maybe we could flatten an entire city. Now, what? Flatten an entire city. Maybe we can do that. All it is numbers. I mean, all it is research. Nobody's done it. It's theoretical physics. And that's why Robert Oppenheimer, I haven't lost you. That's why Robert Oppenheimer, when he did his research, when he earned his PhD in theoretical physics, he went to Germany because that's where they were doing the work. In this country, they were doing applied physics. In other words, you know, how to get more kilowatt power out of an iron, you know, how to get a convection oven to be hotter and cook a turkey in 10 minutes, I don't know. And these guys are saying, you go get it. You Americans don't get it. Do you understand what risks you're at? And that Einstein writes a letter, led to the beginning of the Manhattan Project. Yes, sir.
You mentioned science. Where was Bohr?
Pardon me?
Who was Bohr at the time?
Niels Bohr?
Yeah.
Now, he was around as well. He'd been working in Europe as well. So all of these guys are trying to get what became the Manhattan Project up and going. All right, but I don't want to lose my train of thought here. So this is, the Manhattan Project is a warning. I'll come back to that, if not today, next time we meet. So, the Germans posed a greater threat. But Roosevelt reads his mail. Roosevelt reads the editorial opinion. And Americans wanted something against the Japanese. And from that will come what most people thought certainly appeared to be a suicide mission. You know, and that will be the Jimmy Doolittle raid in April of 1942. You know, we need to do something. And that's a whole story, you know, for a 2-hour conversation. And Jimmy Doolittle, who was always getting in trouble because he was mischievous and didn't take orders well. Not a surprise, like you're having children. They don't take orders well. You don't give them orders. You make suggestions, right? And Doolittle, you know, put together a team of 85 airmen, 5 of whom were from the United States. And he said, we can do what no one's ever done before. Jimmy, you can't do that. To fly B-25 bombers, to fly a bomber off the deck of an aircraft carrier. They can't do that. The runway is too short. You cannot do that. And Doolittle said, I can do it. I can do it. I have a PhD from MIT. I don't mean to rhyme that either. I can do it. I've done it. I've got the math worked out. And I've got 25 volunteers. And they all know it may be a one-way mission. But we got to strike back. And from that came the it wasn't successful militarily, but in terms of promoting, in terms of giving the country some satisfaction, the Doolittle raid. And we've only got enough gas, fellas, to get to the targets. Well, how are we going to get home, Jimmy? That's why it's a one-way mission, fellas, right? We're not going to have enough gas to get home. You figure it out. Most of them got home. They landed in China, didn't they? They caught a tailwind and so forth. And the attack on Tokyo and surrounding cities did absolutely very little physical damage. The one target that Doolittle said, don't even go near this place. Do not attack the imperial palace. If you kill the emperor, they'll never surrender. You know, they've taken an oath of loyalty to the emperor. You are our god. So stay away from the imperial palace. Any other targets are fine. And very little physical damage. It did great emotional damage. How can it be, you know, that after Pearl Harbor, just 4 months later, 5 months later, the Americans are able to launch an attack on Tokyo and surrounding cities? How can that be? And that question was answered once again by Yamamoto. We need to go back to Pearl Harbor and finish the unfinished business. And this time, I will be with the fleet. You know, I will be on the flagship of that fleet. And Nagoon was going with me. He's going with me, but I'm going to be the boss. I am going with them as well. And we are going to lure the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor, and we will destroy it. See, many of the American ships that were bombed were damaged, but they were not put out of commission. Pearl Harbor is a shallow port. It's about 40 feet. So they went into mud, and the repair facilities were not destroyed. So you drag these battleships out of the muck. Maybe they go back to San Diego to be repaired, but many of them can be repaired right here. And now we need to lure them out again. And I'm coming with you. And we're going to send out 2 huge fleets, lure the Americans out, and sink them in 4,000, 5,000 feet of water. So it did not happen that way. At the Battle of Midway, this is the best way to think about the Battle of Midway, is the entire Pacific War, naval war, was turned at Midway. The Japanese lost 4 out of 5 of their aircraft carriers. This was a big hit. You know, we're sending everything. You know, this is Mayday to protect Japan. We're sending everything. And Nagumo got careless, and we can't get into all of the details. He got careless, and when he was told we need to rearm, refuel, and get back to Midway, he said, yes, I made the mistake at Pearl Harbor, but once fooled, shame on me. You know, doing once fooled, shame on you, twice fooled, shame on me. We're going to rearm and reload and go back. And we're going to finish off Midway, and we're going to finish off the American carriers, the American battleships. And he got caught, didn't he? He got caught in a line change. The plane's coming back, being lowered below deck, some on the deck, being refueled and rearmed, and out of the sky came American aircraft. By luck, by happenstance. And 4 out of 5 carriers were lost. And just a word about that. One can replace a carrier, but it is the pilots, isn't it? You know, it's like when you get a call and you say, Dad, I've had an accident. And your first question should be, are you okay? It isn't, how badly damaged is the car? Well, your wife calls, even worse, all right? Or even more importantly, you're more concerned about the car than you are about me? How dare you? We've all been there. You can replace an automobile, you can replace an aircraft carrier. It's the trained pilots. And they died well, but you need hundreds of hours of training. So Midway was a turning point. In 30 minutes, the tide of war, the naval tide of war, turned in the Pacific in the spring of 1942. Now it took time, obviously. MacArthur had to make his way in a long loop up through the Philippines, and then closing in on the Japanese home islands, and the King, Halsey, and Nimitz, the island hopping. You know, but it turned the tide in the Pacific, but it took some time. Yes.
Oh, I was going to ask the year. You said it, so
Okay.
I did my.
I'm done? You're done with me?
I'm done with the.
Oh, you're done with me, okay. I've heard that before. I'm done with you, Gary. Where's the ring? I'm done with you.
Just the question.
It's okay. It's okay. You get the bat, you get back up at home plate, and you dig in, right? Hope springs eternal. That's why there are second, third marriages. You have a starter marriage, and then you move on from there.
Did Japan have carriers before?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. They were navals. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Way before?
naval sim.
No, but did they have them
They had
long
carriers.
before?
The United States began to really have a carrier push. By the way, it just popped back into my head that in 1940, and this helps to explain the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1940, the American Congress, cognizant of how weak we were, at sea and on land, had passed a measure called the Two Ocean Navy Act. We need to have two navies for the Pacific and the Atlantic. We've only got a thin cover in the Pacific, and we've got some cover in the Atlantic. So war is coming. At least Roosevelt knew that, never said it. But boy, he knew how to read he could see that pressure dropping. And it was dropping, and the waves were getting longer and deeper coming across the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Two Ocean Navy Act. We had diplomatic relations with the Japanese. The Two Ocean Navy Act, that the way it was scheduled out from blueprint, from legislation to blueprint to the naval yard, that in 2.5 or 3 years, they'll have more ships than we have. They'll be able to fully defend the Pacific and fully defend the Atlantic. So if we're going to strike, and I've talked about this before, the Americans will be ready in 2.5 years, and they're going to be able to match our Pacific power. We need to strike now. Strike, strike, strike. And then came Midway. Let's go over to Europe for a little bit. Lend-Lease, providing the Allies with supplies. Roosevelt, Roosevelt getting on the radio, and this is alerting people that we need to keep the European war away from us as well. I mean, I can't talk in stereo, otherwise nobody will get it. So we've got the Japanese going, and we need Roosevelt, we need to arm the British. France has fallen. The Dutch are down. The Italians are running amok in southeastern Europe, and so on and so forth. The French are down. Everybody's down. And we need to send supplies to keep England in the war. If England goes down, the Atlantic is an open ocean to the Americans. We need to keep England in the war. Now, Churchill and the British have survived Dunkirk, which should have been the end of the war, and that didn't happen because Hitler broke off the tank attack. He told Guderian, back your tanks down, and we need to allow the Messerschmitts. We need to allow them the glory of finishing off the British Army and the French Army at Dunkirk. So Guderian was told, back the tanks off, and Goering's Luftwaffe, let them finish off the Brits and the struggling French at Dunkirk. They got back, didn't they? The British sent everything that would float to Dunkirk to get it back. And Churchill to Roosevelt, I need help. We're broke. I need help. We can't afford cash and carry. We don't have any money. We're broke. We're about to go down. The Battle of Britain. And Roosevelt was sensitive to that. Britain is our firewall. And he needed to persuade Congress to pony up the money and supplies to keep the British in the war. And he gave one of his famous fireside chats. Roosevelt had a great voice, didn't he? He had a great voice. He had a voice made for promises. You could hear that voice, as it floated out of the radio. A voice made for promises, a voice that one can trust. Papa Bear is here. It's going to be okay. I've got it under control. He had no idea what he was doing. He was blowing smoke and he knew it. But at least he sounded good. And Roosevelt only gave a handful of fireside chats. He didn't want to wear out his welcome with the American voter. And in March of so this would be March of 41, 40 or 41, the dates get mixed up sometimes. There's only one date. I tell my students you have to remember, only one date. That's my birthday. You don't need me for dates. And then I tell them I'm registered at Tree Crump and Low. And I think Toys R Us are back, okay? So that's the only date you need to know. You don't need me for dates, you can always look it up. Just have a sense of chronology, roughly when things are happening. So Roosevelt gets on the radio, and this is using the bully pulpit, TR's bully pulpit, to put pressure on the American people, to put pressure on their House members and their senators, to pass Lend-Lease. And Roosevelt couches it this way, and I'll be brief here. He says, imagine you're sitting at home, and you're home, and you've got the pipe going, and maybe a glass of Chablis, and you're thumbing through the sports page, and suddenly there's an urgent rap on your front door. And you open the door to your neighbor. And your neighbor is absolutely panicked. My house is on fire. My house is on fire. I need to put the fire out. Can I borrow your hose? And then Roosevelt asked a rhetorical question, and what would you do? You would loan your neighbor the hose. And why would you do that? So the fire in his home does not lead to your home. You're a good neighbor. And when that fire is put out, your neighbor will return the hose. So that's all I'm asking. Britain's on fire. Britain's on fire, and we need to loan them the tools of war. And when they put the fire out in their home, it won't spread to our home. Now, so wait a second, what's wrong with this thinking? Things are moving quickly. You mean we're gonna loan them a tank? Whatever they need. Well, what if the tank is blown up? We're gonna loan them an airplane? What if the airplane gets shot down? Well, I'll tell them. And it got passed. It passed. And we are on the cusp of getting involved in the Atlantic, and everything happens, so it begins in the Pacific, don't we? Eisenhower. For Roosevelt, we need to do something against the Germans. We did something with the Doolittle raid. We need to do something against the Germans. And from that will come he working with Montgomery, and other British generals. And this is North Africa, to root out, to root out the Germans out of Rommel, the 8th Army, and the Afrika Corps. Didn't go well. The planning did not go well. It's pretty sloppy. But amphibious operations are difficult. Everything has to go right, and it did. But eventually, Rommel is forced to abandon the 8th Army and get redeployed to France and to begin to construct the Atlantic Wall. So this is one of Eisenhower's first victories, planning and executing, even though it was sloppy, planning and executing an amphibious operation. Now back home, the anger directed against the Japanese Americans was at high tide. It was hot, wasn't it? And on the West Coast, we had the roundup of Japanese Americans, didn't we? About 123,000, most of whom were American citizens. But the fear was the Japanese will be attacking shortly. They're going to come sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge, and these Japanese Americans, most of whom are American citizens, will act as fifth columnists and direct Japanese forces inland where targets are and so on and so forth. So we need to eliminate that risk. And Roosevelt, issuing his executive order that all the West Coast is declared a war zone. The executive order was at 9099 or something like that. The executive order to round up Japanese Americans and to put them for the duration of the war in detention centers away from the coastline. You need to sell your land. You need to sell your car. A great deal of anti-Asian feeling on the West Coast, and it had been there. It had been there since the days of the California Gold Rush. And Chinese and Japanese could take land that no white farmer could get anything to grow on and turn it into a Garden of Eden. And we want your land. You're successful. We want your land. So with the war, round these people up and sell your home, sell your car, sell your land for a dime on a dollar, a nickel on a dollar, because you're being transported inland in detention centers until the war is over or it's safe to allow you to go back home. And we know, don't we, that a great injustice was done here. Eleanor Roosevelt, when she found out about this executive order, she raised hell with Franklin. And as Franklin's aides remember, that Roosevelt never shouted. He never lost his voice. He might grimace or maybe rap the table. But as they remember, he roared Eleanor down. Quiet, woman. Hush. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is a military matter. Quiet. Hush. Okay. Okay. And as aides remember, the only time they could recall Roosevelt raising his voice to Eleanor, you have no idea what you're talking about. Quiet. So the roundup begins, and you bring a piano, you bring your china, you bring paintings, you bring jewelry, and you turn it in at the detention center, and you're given a ticket. That when the war is over, when you come back, present this, and your piano will be here, or your jewelry, or your camera equipment, or your automobile, whatever. Well, you know what happened. It was all gone. And your homes were confiscated because you didn't pay taxes. Well, how can we pay taxes when we're in jail? Well, that's not my problem. You're Japanese. That's why you're in jail. And the leopard cannot change its spots. We heard that on the floor of Congress. The leopard cannot change its spots. You are always Japanese. And your loyalty is to the emperor. And you're a threat. Round them up. And when the war was, and for many Japanese, that's just the way it was. Just the way it happened. It's the way it went down. And the camps were run by the army, and they were surrounded with barbed wire. There were machine gun nests in the corners. And when 1944 came, and it was clear that the tide of war was changing. The young Japanese men were asked if you want to enlist, you may enlist. And they did. And that was the storied 442nd Regiment, the most decorated unit during World War II, the most decorated American unit of all of World War II. They were called the Christmas Tree Regiment because they had so many decorations, so many citations and so forth. The Supreme Court, the roundup made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 6-3. We're at war. And you ought to be happy that you've been rounded up. Because if you were left alone on the streets, you would have been beaten and killed. We did you a service to round you up, to protect you from the anger, the vengeance. 6-3. So you ought to be happy you're in prison. And when the war is turned, we'll change the terms of that as well. That coming from Executive Order 9066. That's what it was. I flipped the 6. Executive Order 9066, round them all up. So by 1943, Rosie the River is on station, isn't she? And this was a good time for women and learning. I can do this job. I can be a manager. I can do this job. I can run a shift. I can meet my quota on tanks, aircraft, whatever. I can do this job and make good money. And I've got these guys working for me. And by 1943, certainly by 1944, American industry was outproducing German, Italian, and Japanese industry across the board. We were unbombed. Our factories were not attacked and blitzed as they were in Italy and Japan and Germany. So we won that war, the production war. And as Truman will say later on, since I mentioned this, as Truman will say after the atomic bomb is dropped, we won the battle of the laboratories. The Japanese had a program going as well for an atomic bomb. We won the battle of the laboratories. We got it there first to end the war. So here we are in 43. In Europe, in 43, Stalingrad had fallen. Stalingrad is one of the turning points in Eastern Europe. And remember, for Hitler, the Third Reich, which will endure for 1,000 years, as Hitler would boast, as he would brag, men like me, only come about once in 1,000 years. And I have the will, and that was the word he used often, the will to do this. And a Third Reich that will endure for 1,000 years. We will be a continental power. So when he used the term Third Reich, it begged the question, was there a first and second? And the answer is yes. And as Hitler read history, the First Reich was Charlemagne, creating a greater Germania inside what became Germany. You know, uniting all these little duchies, the little cities, the little townships, and so forth. The Second Reich was Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, using Prussia as the core for a greater Germany. And my Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Reich, will be in Eastern Europe for the resources, Lebensraum, living space. And we will teach the Russians Judeo-Bolshevism. We will teach the Russians enough German so they can read street signs and follow orders. This is a war to the knife. I mean, this will be a genocidal war. This will be a war of extermination. This will be a war of Lebensraum. This is where the future of the Third Reich will be. In Poland, in the Baltic, in Southeastern Europe, and the western parts of Russia. And everything was rolling until Stalingrad. And then we have Rommel being defeated in the Afrika Corps at the Battle of El Alamein. Midway, it turned the tide of the naval war against the Japanese at Midway. And things are beginning to shift. In January of 1943, and I'll close it here, and we can do some questions if you like. In January of 43, Churchill and Roosevelt met together at Casablanca. Stalin did not, because there was the German army, they were in the suburbs of Paris, they were in the suburbs of, not Paris, in the suburbs of Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad. I mean, the Battle of Stalingrad, fierce, fierce, fierce. They fought room to room. I mean, never mind house to house, room to room. And there's still German soldiers buried in the area of Stalingrad and still trying to recover them and identify them, however that can be done. At Casablanca, 1943 January, Roosevelt and Churchill announced a policy, unconditional surrender. There will be no terms offered to Mussolini. There'll be no terms offered to Tojo in Japan. There'll be no terms offered to Hitler. Unconditional surrender. No terms, no discussions. We will smash you. And then we'll talk about what a victor's peace will look like, not a negotiated peace. So let me stop here in that year of 43, Stalingrad, Midway, and El Alamein, and the beginning of the contraction of the war toward Berlin and toward the Philippines and certainly toward Tokyo, because what we have to do next time we meet. Are we meeting next week?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean we have to. We have to talk about the atomic bomb. We have to talk about D-Day. We have to. That's the day that changed everything in Europe. And the atomic bomb ended the war like that, didn't it? Maybe a question? I know I'm moving quickly. I just want to be able to get to a certain point here, and I'm there. All right? I'm going to anchor in 1943.
How did the First World War lead to the Second World War?
Oh, you got about 3 days. I got to get down 128. And this is a tough time on 128. Well, the next 30 minutes will be tough. World War I. Particularly the peace treaty with Germany, that they lost land. They lost a lot of land. The disarmament. They had to pay for the war. It was called reparations. And accept a Western-imposed government, the Weimar Republic. And Weimar, a sleepy, leafy town where there were universities, not Berlin, not Potsdam. That we were never beaten. We were never beaten. We marched home in good order behind our officers, and we signed what we thought was an armistice, a ceasefire. And when our armies came home and disbanded, and there was chaos in the streets with the communist uprising, and we were told that we had been beaten, and you have to accept this Versailles Treaty and sign it. Hitler got his voice with the Versailles Treaty. You know, that we were never beaten. We were stabbed in the back. The German army fighting on the frontier, stabbed in the back by traitors. Who were they? Professors. Weimar. Who were they? Liberals. Who were they? Jews. Who were they? Intellectuals. Who were they? Writers. We were stabbed in the back. And that's why, I'm tipping my hand here, when Hitler survived the last attempt on his life, Operation Valkyrie, Germany, the attempt was to stab us in the back again. But I survived that attack, and I will visit Nazi justice on those families. Nazi justice on those families who tried to stab Germany in the back again. We'll do that the next time you meet, next week. So there you go. I mean, you could do a 15-week course on the run-up to World War I. We could do 15 weeks on World War II. I mean, you got me at 78 RPM. Not 30. Bada bing, bada bing, bada boom, bada bing.
I want to congratulate for such a complicated issue. You went through it very smoothly.
Thank you. I tried to pull it together, and we're at 43. That's a good year. 43, and we're on to 44, and we're on to 45. VE Day, VJ Day, and to bring G.I. Joe and G.I. Jane home. That guy, my dad, would write into that gal. They called them gals back then. It was okay. Still is okay today in my book. Writing to Shirley. I want to get home to Shirley. All right, and I want to marry her. And he did. There was no invasion of the Japanese home islands. I'm proof of that. All right. There's a little story behind that as well. I'll see you all later. Thank you.